ever look at a cell under a microscope? It's kind of wild to think how much is going on in such a tiny space. You'd think it'd be static, just sitting there. But no way. It's a non-stop party of chemical changes, like a little city that never sleeps.
Oh, absolutely. It's mind-boggling how many reactions are happening at any given moment. And that's what we're talking about today, right? Cellular metabolism. The name's a bit of a giveaway, actually. Comes from Greek, means change.
So change is at the heart of it. Change of what, exactly? What are the main players in this cellular drama?
The stars of the show, those are the big four. Carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Basically, the molecules that make up life as we know it.
And they're constantly being shifted around, built up, broken down. Which brings us to those two processes we hear about, anabolism and catabolism.
Right on. Anabolism, sometimes called assimilation, that's the construction crew. Taking simple stuff and making it complex, like building a house from bricks.
But construction takes energy, right? Where's the cell getting its power tools?
Depends who you ask. Plants, algae, those guys, they're solar powered, direct from the sun. But us, we got to eat for that energy.
Okay, so anabolism builds, needs energy input, and catabolism, that's the opposite.
You got it. Catabolism, or dissimilation if you want to get fancy, that's demolition. Breaking things down, releasing energy, like dismantling that house, getting some energy back from the process.
And that energy is what keeps the whole cell running, all those tiny tasks adding up to, well, us.
Precisely. Muscles, brain, everything. And there are a couple of ways cells do this breakdown. Fermentation and cellular respiration.
Fermentation rings a bell. That's what makes bread rise, right? Or beer bubbly.
Yeah, that's one type. But the key difference is oxygen. Fermentation, no oxygen needed. Cellular respiration, oxygen's the star. Makes it way more efficient at getting energy out.
Oxygen, the efficiency booster. Before we go deeper, let's talk about energy itself. In a cell, what does that even mean?
Energy is the ability to do work at its most basic. Even just turning a page, that's energy. You might not see it directly, but it's there.
Right, we see the result. And there are different kinds of energy at play, yeah.
You bet. Kinetic and potential. Kinetic, think motion. Water flowing, ball rolling, even heat. That's molecules jiggling around. All kinetic.
So movement is kinetic. What about potential?
Potential is stored up, like water behind a dam, or a kid at the top of a slide. Or, and this is important for cells, chemical energy in the bonds of molecules, like a coiled spring, ready to go.
So chemical bonds are like little energy packs. How's that potential energy turned into the kinetic kind that the cell actually uses?
Chemical reactions, that's the key. Atoms get rearranged, those bonds break and form, and boom, potential becomes kinetic. Burning fuel, that's the classic example.
The cell's burning fuel too, but in a more, shall we say, organized fashion.
Way more organized. Cells love glucose, it's their go-to fuel. Break it down, energy out. But not all that energy is usable. Some gets lost as heat, the useful stuff. That's free energy.
Free energy, the stuff the cell can spend. But it can't just plug a glucose molecule into a muscle and call it a day, right? There's got to be a middleman.
Enter ATP, adenosine triphosphate, if you want to be formal. It's like the cell's cash. Universal energy currency. Every cell uses it.
I like that. Cash is something we all understand. What's this ATP made of structurally?
It's adenosine that's a base called adenine, plus a sugar called ribose, with 3 phosphate groups hanging off. And those phosphates, they're where the magic happens.
So what kind of work does this cellular cash actually pay for?
Oh, all sorts. First, mechanical. Think tiny hairs called flagella that make cells swim, muscles contracting, stuff moving around inside the cell. Then there's transport work, moving molecules across membranes, sometimes uphill, that takes energy. And lastly, chemical work, building things up like proteins from amino acids, anabolism in action.
So ATP is the key to getting things done. But where does its own energy come from? What makes it so powerful?
The bonds between those phosphates, especially the last two, they're high energy. Break one off, energy out, we call that hydrolysis. And ADP becomes ADP, adenosine diphosphate, one less phosphate.
So ATP loses a phosphate, releases energy, becomes ADP. Is ADP then just useless, like a spent battery?
Not at all. ADP gets recharged back to ATP. Add that phosphate back on, that's phosphorylation. Takes energy input, though, which comes from breaking down food, as we'll see.
So it's a cycle. ATP, power stuff, becomes ADP, gets recharged back to ATP. A cellular battery constantly being used and recharged. How fast does this actually happen?
Blazing fast. In a muscle cell, for example, about 10 million ATPs are made every second. It's not a big stockpile, more like constant flow, meeting demand as it comes.
10 million per second. That puts it in perspective. Okay, let's talk about how this ATP is made from the food we eat.
That's where cellular respiration takes center stage. The process of extracting that stored energy from food, it's more complex than just dissolving it, obviously.
You're telling me, so what's the cell's trick?
Enzymes, they're proteins. They speed up reactions, and they break down those complex food molecules into simpler stuff. That releases energy. Some gets used for work, some escapes as heat. That's why you warm up when you exercise, by the way.
Makes sense. And this is all happening mainly through cellular respiration.
You got it. It's the most efficient way cells get energy. Needs oxygen, though, and some organic fuel, glucose being the classic example.
You compared this to a car engine before. Could you unpack that a bit? I'm a visual learner.
Sure. Think of glucose like gasoline. In the engine, gasoline burns with oxygen, releases energy to move the car. Same idea here. Glucose is burned with oxygen, makes carbon dioxide, water, and that energy to make ATP.
Okay, so that's the big picture. What's the actual chemical equation for this cellular burning?
For glucose, it's C6H12O6 plus 6O2 makes 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus energy. That's glucose plus oxygen making carbon dioxide, water, and energy, both as ATP and some heat. We often talk about glucose, but carbs, fats, proteins can all be fuel.
We see what goes in, what comes out. But where exactly does this energy release happen on a molecular level?
It's all about electrons. Moving electrons, that's where the energy's at. We call these redox reactions, short for reduction oxidation. Electrons moving from glucose, that's what powers ATP production. Think of it like passing a hot potato. That's energy transfer in the cell.
Redox, yeah, vaguely remember that. Refresh my memory. What's going on there?
Redox is when electrons get exchanged. Lose electrons, that's oxidation. Gain them, reduction. They always go together. Someone loses, someone gains. Like sodium and chlorine making salt. Sodium loses an electron, becomes positive. Chlorine gains it, becomes negative.
One loses, the other wins. Gotcha. But you mentioned not all redox is complete electron handoff.
Right. Sometimes it's about sharing. Electrons and bonds get pulled more one way or another depending on the atoms. Electronegativity, that's what we call the atoms pull on electrons.
Electronegativity, yeah, the higher it is, the more an atom wants those electrons.
Exactly. Like take methane, natural gas. It burns with oxygen, makes carbon dioxide and water. Now, the oxygen, it's got higher electronegativity, so in the new bonds, the electrons spend more time around oxygen. The carbon's kind of lost them in a way, so it's oxidized. Oxygen's gained electron density, it's reduced.
So even a shift in sharing counts as redox. How does this apply to the cell and its energy?
Think of it like this. More electronegative atom, harder to pull an electron away. Less electronegative, easier at pulling a magnet off something. So in respiration, electrons fall from glucose with its carbon and hydrogen towards oxygen, the electronegativity champ. That fall releases energy the cell can grab. That's why hydrogen-rich molecules are good fuel. Their electrons are ready to fall and release energy.
I like that analogy. So this energy release in the cell, it's not one big explosion, right? It's more controlled. Why is that important?
Good point. Glucose has a lot of energy, but it doesn't just burst into flames. There's an activation energy, a hump to get over. Enzymes lower that hump, so reactions happen at body temperature, and releasing all the energy at once. Too much, too fast. Think exploding gas tank versus smooth engine.
Slow and steady wins the race. How does the cell manage this gradual release then?
Lots of small steps. Glucose is oxidized bit by bit, each step with its own enzyme. And here's the neat part. Electrons get stripped off glucose, but they don't go straight to oxygen. They hitch a ride with NAD plus nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, a mouthful I know. Think of NAD plus like an empty taxi for electrons.
NAD plus started. Got it. What does it do once it's got these electrons?
It becomes NADH, an enzyme called dehydrogenase that grabs 2 electrons and a proton from glucose. NAD plus takes those electrons plus another proton, turns into NADH. The other proton just hangs out in the solution.
So NAD plus becomes NADH. The taxi's full now. What's the difference between them, energy-wise?
NAD plus the empty taxi, it's positive, wants those electrons. NADH, it's got them. It's neutral, energy-rich. But the electrons haven't lost all their energy yet, just a bit. NADH is still holding on to that potential to make ATP.
You talked about hydrogen and oxygen forming water before.
Yeah.
How does NAD plus fit into that story in the context of the cell?
Right, so hydrogen and oxygen, they're happy to react, make water, big energy release, boom. That's what happens if you just mix them and spark it. But respiration, it's also combining hydrogen and oxygen eventually. But it's controlled. The hydrogen comes from the food. And it uses this thing called the electron transport chain instead of one big bang.
Yeah.
NAD plus is one of the first to pick up those electrons from the fuel, starting the journey.
Electron transport chain sounds like a cellular highway. What's going on there?
It's more like a series of steps, actually.
Right.
Happens in the mitochondria, the cell's powerhouse. It's in the inner membrane specifically. So you got these protein complexes lined up, and electrons from NADH and another carrier called FADH2. They get passed along this chain, each handoff, a little bit of energy released, and this whole time, those electrons are heading towards the final boss, oxygen, to make water.
So instead of one big drop, it's a staircase releasing energy at each step. What happens to that released energy?
It pumps protons, those are H plus ions across the membrane, creates this gradient like a dam, more protons on one side, and this gradient, it drives ATP production. The protons flow back through a special enzyme, ADP synthase, like a water wheel, and that makes ATP from ADP and phosphate. And just to impress you, one mitochondrion can have like 100,000 of these chains.
Wow, that's a lot of energy production going on. We've mentioned the three stages of respiration: glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and electron transport chain. Can we break those down a bit more?
Of course. These three, they work together to squeeze all that energy from glucose.
Starting with glycolysis, where does that happen and what's its main job?
Glycolysis, that's out in the cytoplasm, not in the mitochondria yet. You take glucose, 6 carbons, split it into 2 pyruvates, 3 carbons each, 10 steps, each with its own enzyme. And you get a little ATP directly, 2 molecules plus 2 NADH, those taxis picking up electrons.
Okay, so glycolysis is like the first breakdown outside the powerhouse, makes a little energy and some electron carriers. What happens to pyruvate then?
Pyruvate has to get into the mitochondria. The real action's in there. So it goes across the membrane into the matrix, the innermost part. And there, it gets turned into acetyl-CoA, 2 carbons now, releases a carbon dioxide, and another NAD plus gets reduced to NADH, more passengers for the taxi.
Pyruvate to acetyl-CoA in the mitochondria, more NADH and CO2 as a byproduct. Setting the stage for the citric acid cycle, right? Where does that one fit in?
Citric acid cycle, also called the Krebs cycle. That's in the mitochondrial matrix too. It's a cycle, 8 steps, each with its own enzyme. Basically, it finishes the job, breaks down acetyl-CoA all the way to carbon dioxide. Those 2 carbons that came in, they get released as CO2.
And what about energy from the citric acid cycle itself?
A little bit directly, like glycolysis, a couple of ATPs. But the main thing is it loads up those electron carriers. For each glucose that started this whole thing, the cycle makes 6 NADH and 2 FADH2. That's another carrier, different kind of taxi.
So not much ATP directly, but a lot of loading up the taxis. Which brings us to the final stage, the electron transport chain. How does it use all those loaded carriers to make the big bucks, energy-wise?
So this chain is embedded in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. It takes the electrons from NADH and FADH2, passes them down the line like a bucket brigade. Each handoff releases energy, and it all ends with oxygen grabbing the electrons, making water. The energy released, it's used to pump those protons, remember them, across the membrane. Creates that gradient, that potential energy.
Right, the proton dam. And then the protons flow back, powering ATP synthase.
Exactly. And that makes the bulk of the ATP. Out of the total, about 32 ATP per glucose come from the electron transport chain and that proton flow. A tiny bit from glycolysis and the citric acid cycle directly.
Cellular respiration, very efficient, needs oxygen, makes a lot of energy. But what about when oxygen's not around? That's where fermentation comes in, if I recall.
You got it. Fermentation. That's the backup plan. Still gets some energy from glucose, even without oxygen, like a generator when the power's out.
But how does that work? Doesn't oxygen grab the electrons at the end?
True for respiration.
Okay.
But the very first part, glycolysis, that doesn't need oxygen. It can run on its own, makes a little ATP and NADH.
Right, but if there's no oxygen, NADH can't unload those electrons, the taxis get full, and glycolysis stops, right?
Bingo. That's the problem fermentation solves. It's basically a way to empty those taxis so glycolysis can keep going. NADH dumps its electrons onto pyruvate or something made from pyruvate, and NAD plus is back, ready for more.
So fermentation is glycolysis plus a recycling system for NAD plus diamine.
Exactly. Keeps a little energy flowing, even in tough times.
And there are different types of fermentation, right? I've heard of lactic acid and alcohol fermentation.
Those are the famous two.
Yeah.
Alcohol fermentation, that's yeast and some bacteria. They take pyruvate, make ethanol, that's the alcohol we drink, and carbon dioxide. That's what makes bread rise and beer fizzy.
And lactic acid, that's what makes yogurt tangy, right?
Yep. Some fungi and bacteria use that one. Pyruvate gets turned directly into lactic acid thanks to NADH. Fun fact, our muscles do this too when we exercise really hard. Oxygen runs low. That's where that burn comes from, lactic acid buildup.
So fermentation is a handy backup, but not as energy-rich as respiration, I'd imagine.
Right. It skips the big energy makers, the citric acid cycle, and electron transport chain. So you only get those 2 ATPs from glycolysis, all that potential energy in pyruvate, gone to waste.
We've focused on glucose, but we eat more than sugar, obviously. What about fats and proteins? Can those be energy sources too, and how do they fit in?
Oh, our bodies are way more flexible than we give them credit for. We can use all sorts of fuel. Most of our energy actually comes from carbs, like sucrose and starch, then fats, then proteins. They can all be broken down for ATP.
So how do these different foods get into the respiration game?
Carbs, they get digested to simple sugars, mostly glucose, straight into glycolysis, then the cycle, then the chain. Even glycogen, our stored glucose, can be broken down when needed.
What about fats? Aren't those packed with energy?
They are more than twice the ATP per gram compared to carbs. That's because they're full of hydrogen, and hydrogen means high-energy electrons, remember. Fats get broken down into glycerol and fatty acids. Glycerol can become a glycolysis intermediate. Fatty acids, they get chopped up into two carbon bits, and guess what? Those bits are acetyl-CoA straight into the citric acid cycle.
So fats skip the line right into the cycle. And proteins, can we burn those for energy too?
We can, though it's not our favorite. Proteins get broken into amino acids. Then they get deaminated, which means their nitrogen group gets removed. The leftovers, they can be turned into various molecules that fit into glycolysis or the citric acid cycle. Depends on the amino acid.
It's amazing how all these different foods find their way into these pathways. Shows how connected everything is. But we've been talking about breaking things down. What about building things up? Enablism, where do the energy and materials for that come from?
That's the other side of the coin, right? Food isn't just fuel, it's also building blocks. Enablism, biosynthesis, that's what we call making stuff, like making glycogen from glucose, proteins from amino acids, even copy our DNA.
And that takes energy too. I'm assuming ATP is the currency here as well.
Absolutely. ATP from breaking things down powers the building up. And the materials themselves, they either come directly from food or they're made using molecules from those breakdown pathways.
So glycolysis and the citric acid cycle, they're not just energy providers, they're also supplying parts for other molecules.
Precisely. They're like metabolic hubs. Lots of the molecules in those pathways can be changed into other things. Like if we eat too much, carbs and proteins can get turned into fat for storage, even if we haven't eaten much fat. That's how we gain weight no matter what we overeat.
It all comes together. We've focused on how WE get energy, being heterotrophs and all. What about autotrophs, the plants? How do they get their energy and building blocks?
That brings us to photosynthesis, the ultimate anabolic process. It's how plants, algae, some bacteria, they capture light energy from the sun and store it in molecules, mainly glucose. It's mind-blowing, but pretty much all life on Earth depends on this. Plants are the ultimate providers.
So plants are like the base of the food chain, turning light into fuel for everyone else. How do they do it, though? What's the magic trick?
They have these things called chloroplasts in their cells, mostly in the leaves. Inside there's chlorophyll, the pigment that makes them green. Chlorophyll can absorb light energy, and that energy is used to combine carbon dioxide from the air and water from the soil to make glucose and oxygen. And that oxygen, that's what we breathe. Pretty much all of it comes from photosynthesis.
Wow, so every breath is a gift from plants. Amazing. What's the chemical equation for this life-giving process?
It's basically the reverse of respiration. 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus light energy makes C6H12O6 plus 6O2. That's carbon dioxide and water plus light making glucose and oxygen. Simple on paper, but a whole lot going on behind the scenes.
You mentioned autotrophs, self-feeders. What makes them different from us heterotrophs?
Autotrophs, they make their own food from scratch, inorganic stuff. Plants, algae, some bacteria using light, those are photoautotrophs. Some bacteria use chemicals, chemoautotrophs. But us heterotrophs, other feeders, we got to eat other things, plants or animals, to get our organic molecules. We rely on those autotrophs for everything.
So, the food chain, powered by plants. Now, is photosynthesis just respiration in reverse? Could plants run their mitochondria backwards and call it a day?
It's tempting to think so, but nope. The overall equations might look opposite, but the pathways are different, and they happen in different places. Photosynthesis is redox, but it's pushing electrons uphill from water to glucose, needs energy input from the sun. Respiration is downhill, releasing energy. So plants can't just reverse their engines. They need chloroplasts and sunlight.
Makes sense, you can't break the laws of physics. But how does photosynthesis actually happen, step by step? Is it also in stages, like respiration?
It is, two main stages. The light reactions and the dark reactions, also called the Calvin cycle. Light reactions happen in the thylakoid membranes inside chloroplasts where the chlorophyll is. Light gets absorbed. That energy is used to make ATP and another carrier, NADPH. Water gets split. releasing oxygen, and chlorophyll steals electrons from water to replace the ones it lost.
Okay, so light reactions capture sunlight, make ATP and NADPH, and split water, releasing oxygen. What about the Calvin cycle? What's its role?
The Calvin cycle happens in the stroma, the fluid around those thylakoids. It takes carbon dioxide from the air and adds it to existing molecules. We call that carbon fixation. Then, using the ATP and NADPH from the light reactions, it adds electrons to this fixed carbon, reducing it, and eventually making glucose and other organic molecules. So it's like a building process, powered by the energy captured from light.
Like a tiny solar-powered sugar factory. Amazing. What happens to all that glucose the plant makes?
Well, the plant needs to eat too, right? About half of it gets used in the plant's own mitochondria for respiration, making ATP for growth and other functions. The rest is building material, making cellulose for cell walls, other carbs, lipids, proteins, everything the plant needs. It's important to remember that only the green parts, the ones with chloroplasts, can make their own food. The rest depend on the green parts sending them sugars, mostly sucrose, through their vascular system.
So everything's connected. Plants make food from sunlight, we eat plants or animals that eat plants, and it all goes back to those tiny processes, respiration and photosynthesis.
Exactly. This constant cycle of energy and matter, that's what life on Earth is all about. It's mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really is. Every bite we take, every breath, it's all part of this incredible story happening on a microscopic level. Thanks for taking us on this deep dive into the world of cellular metabolism. It's given us a whole new appreciation for the complexity and beauty of life.
My pleasure.